We can turn, we're going to be all over in the Bible, in Proverbs at least this morning. And we live in a society that says that the one that ends with the most toys, wins. And we live in a society that believes the phrase, the concept of God helps those who help themselves. They think that's in the Bible. In fact, the previous president said, I trust in God, but God wants to see us help ourselves by putting people back to work. The press secretary was later asked about that, and he clarified it by saying, well, I believe the phrase from the Bible is God helps those who help themselves. In fact, the press secretary is in good company. One statistic I read said over 50% of Americans, another one said close to 3/4 of Americans, 75% of Americans believe that phrase is in the Bible. God helps those who help themselves. What does the Bible really teach? God helps the helpless, right? And those who trust in themselves are fools, Proverbs 28:26. As we continue our series on gratitude, we're going to look at an attitude this morning, generosity. That if you possess this attitude of being generous, it will help you to have that spirit of gratitude. Rather than that spirit of greed or of helping yourselves, focusing on yourselves, finishing with the most toys, the idea, the concept of being generous. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this day. We thank you for the truths found in Scripture. We thank you for the opportunity to gather together to worship and praise you. And we do lift up those in prayer that are currently battling COVID, those that are quarantined as a result of them having COVID or somebody they know having COVID or coming in contact with somebody with COVID. Lord, it's just an interesting time that we live in. But we thank you that you are on your throne, that you are still God, that you still rule. And we just give you the praise and the glory for that. We just ask that you be with us this morning as we look into your word, that you would guide and direct, and that we would allow your Spirit to work in our lives. We ask and pray these things in your Son's name. Amen. First thing we see is the divine pattern of generosity, and that is God's blessing brings wealth. Proverbs 10:22. Proverbs 10:22. God's blessing brings wealth. The blessing of the Lord brings wealth without painful toil for it. The blessing of the Lord brings wealth without painful toil for it. That last phrase, without painful toil for it, one commentator said this: the point is not that human effort is useless, but rather that human effort cannot make an addition to the blessing of God. And this is in contrast to the idea of people achieving wealth by their own efforts, right? It's everything that they do. But Psalm 127, 1 and 2 says this: unless the Lord builds the house, its builders labor in vain. In vain you rise early and stay up late, toiling for food to eat, for God grants sleep to those he loves. Right? The blessing of the Lord brings wealth. All that we have comes from God, and is a blessing from him. Now you may object, Pastor Mo, I don't have wealth. Therefore, why is the Lord not blessing me? And there will be two answers to that I want to share this morning. First, we have to remember that Proverbs are principles, not promises. In general, they are true. They can be true 90% of the time, 95, 99% of the time. But they may not be true in all cases. And the example I share when I teach that idea, that Proverbs are principles, not promises, is the proverb that says, raise up a child in the way they should go. When they're older, they will not depart from it. But we all know children that have been raised up in the way they should go. When they've gotten older, they've departed from it. And the example I give is a good friend of mine, 6 kids. One sister is a missionary. One sister married a pastor. Another sister married a seminary administrator, or at least that's where they're at now in this phase of life. Another one married a school administrator, very active in this church, and my friend is a pastor. But the 6th sibling just lives their life the way they want to live it. Not living it for God. Now, did the parents do something different with that other middle sibling? I don't think so. I think the proverb in this case, for the most part, 5 out of 6 times, raise up the child in the way they should go. When they're older, they didn't depart from it. But the one case, they did, because they're promises, they're principles, not promises. And the second answer to that, what is the definition of wealth? Right? Oh, I'm not wealthy. I think the definition of wealth a lot of times in our society is, who's wealthy is anybody that has more than me, right? So you have millionaires, like, well, yeah, I'm not wealthy because this person has $10 million or $20 million. And the millionaires, like, well, I'm not wealthy because these people have hundreds of millions of dollars. And then they're not wealthy because there's a couple billionaires out there. They're the ones that are wealthy. Right? It's always somebody that has more than us. They're the wealthy ones. We ourselves are never wealthy. This statistic, 71% of the world lives on less than $10 a day. That's $3,650 for the year. In light of the rest of the world, we could probably say most of us are wealthy. If we compare ourselves to the Bill Gates or the Warren Buffetts of our country, we're not in that category. But if we really were honest, God has blessed us beyond what we could imagine. God's blessing brings wealth. Along with that divine pattern of generosity, because all that we have from God, number 2 there in your outline, we need to use it wisely. We need to use it wisely. We need to be good stewards of everything that God's entrusted to us. One exercise in the Crown Financial study that we did years ago was to deed over all your possessions to God. And so there's a little thing there, and you actually did the exercise. Okay, I'm giving my house to God. I'm giving my car to God. Everything that we have, we give over to God. And then they said for this week, just do this exercise. Don't refer to it as your house, your car. Refer to it as God's house, God's car, God's table, God's chairs. And just teaching us that concept, that idea that everything we have comes from God and everything is God's. We're just stewards of it. And so we need to be good stewards of everything that we have. We need to relinquish ownership and realize we're just taking care of these possessions, this money. We need to make sure that when we use it wisely. God's blessing brings wealth. Now, there are 2 opposite attitudes of generosity we see in the Proverbs, probably more, but 2 I want to share this morning. And the first one is insensitivity to the needy people that you meet, Proverbs 21:13. Whoever shuts their ears to the cry of the poor will also cry out and not be answered. Whoever shuts their ears to the cry of the poor will also cry out and not be answered. It's assumed here in this proverb that the person who is helping, or whose help is now being sought after at least, not helping, but being sought for, could themselves at some time in the future need help. Right? Whoever shuts their ears to the cry of the poor, so someone's poor, they need help, but you decide to shut your ears to them, will also cry out and not be answered. So at some point in their life, they're in need. Right? And so they cry out for help. And the proverb says here, if you're shutting your ears to those in need now, when there comes a time for you to be in need, no one's going to answer you. God puts needy people in our path so that we can help them with their needs. And through the process, they can, and through that process, we can learn to be sensitive and compassionate. I think sometimes it's easy to kind of just sit back, complain about others, judge others. An opposite attitude to generosity is insensitivity. I came across this quote: when we refuse to look at them, we become blind. When we refuse to listen to them, we become deaf. And when we refuse to feel for them, we become cold and hard. It's easy to become insensitive, to become cold and hard. An opposite attitude of generosity is being insensitive to the needs of others. A second opposite attitude of generosity is greed. Proverbs 28:8. Whoever increases wealth by taking interest or profit from the poor amasses it for another, who will be kind to the poor. So you have someone here that's increasing their wealth by taking interest and profit from the poor, so they're taking advantage of them in their need. It says here that they're going to amass it for another who's going to be kind to the poor. As we stated, a generous person recognizes that everything that they have comes from God, and they're a stewardship of it. A couple weeks ago I mentioned that show, American Greed. It seems like almost in every episode what's happening is somebody's taking money that's designated for something, usually some type of investment, and they're embezzling it for their own use, right? They're buying the luxury house, the luxury yacht or boat, the luxury cars, going on the fancy trips. When you and I practice greed, You and I are embezzling what God intended to be passed on to others in need. We're holding on to that. We're hoarding it. We're keeping it for ourselves, even though God intended it to be used for others. The Proverbs states that eventually, though, God sees to it that these resources go to its desired end. So if you're that type of person that's acting in the way of greed and you're holding on to that stuff, the proverb says what you're doing is you're amassing it for another who's going to be kind to the poor. So at some point, your wealth that you're holding on to that you can't let go of because of your greed is going to be passed on to somebody else. Maybe it's in your death. Yeah, maybe it's not till then, but it will be passed on to somebody else who eventually will be kind to the poor. So those are two opposite attitudes of generosity and sensitivity and greed. Next, I want to look at 4 principles of generosity. 4 principles of generosity. The first one there is generous people give when they can. Generous people give when they can. Proverbs 21:26, starting there at verse 25. The sluggard's craving will be the death of him, because his hands refuse to work. All day long he craves for more, but the righteous give without sparing. So you have a contrast here in this proverb. You have the sluggard. The sluggard desires more and more. That's what they want. They want more. They want more stuff. But then, kind of ironically, they're refusing to work. Right? Their craving is going to be the death of them, but their hands refuse to work. They want more stuff. They want more stuff, but they're not going to work for it. Then you have the contrast to the righteous person who give, and then they give some more, and then they give some more. So they have, and yet they're willing to give. The one attitude is all about wanting more. The other attitude is about helping others, even if it means you will end up with less. And that's the pattern that we see of the wise woman in Proverbs 31:20. She opens her arms to the poor and extends her hands to the needy. She's ministering to those in need. Her hands, her arms are mentioned in this proverb. Those are used for her own self-interest, right? You use your hands and arms for yourself to help you through the day. And this woman's an industrious woman, so she's using it to help bring wealth, but she's not just using it for her own selfish gain and focusing on herself. She's using her arms and her arms and her hands here she opens her arms to the poor, extends her hands to the needy. Her arms open wide to help those that have need. Generous people give when they can. They use their hands, they use their arms, they use what they have available to them to give. And they give without sparing. A second principle of generosity: generous people help if they are able. Proverbs 11:24-26. There's one who scatters and yet increases all the more. And there's one who withholds what is justly due, and yet it results only in want. The generous man will be prosperous, and he who waters will himself be watered. He who withholds grain, the people will curse him, but blessing will be on the head of him who sells it. So Proverbs 24 there, you have the one who scatters, just giving, and yet increases all the more. And then you have the one who's withholding what is justly due, right? So it's something they should be giving away for whatever reason. They should be giving away, but they're withholding what's justly due, and yet it results only in want. Right? They just want more, right? They can't get enough. And that's the concept that we saw with greed. It's never enough. I think John Rockefeller was asked, how much more money do you need? He's like, just $1 more. Right? Well, that's never enough, right? Because once you get that $1, then you just need $1 more. And just $1 more. But those who scatter, increase all the more. And then Proverbs 26 there, he who withholds grain, the people will curse him. But blessing will be on the head of him who sells it. Here you got two people compared. You have the grain speculator who's holding on to his crop, driving up the price rather than selling it to those who have need for it. He who withholds grain, the people will curse him. Right? There's somebody here that needs grain. The people need the grain, but he's holding on to it. And the longer he holds on to it, probably the more it's going to be worth to him. But then you have the generous man who sells to those who are in need. It says there, the blessing will be on the head of him who sells it. Those who refuse to sell because of whatever reason are profiting from the future rise in the value. And the hardship they cause results in cursing, right? He withholds the grain, the people curse him. In contrast, a generous person who's going to forego a larger profit, they're not just giving it away, they are selling it. Right? The blessing will be on the head of him who sells it, but they're just not holding on to it, trying to profit more and make an excessive profit. So they're still making a profit, just not trying to make a larger profit. For the sake of the common good, he who's willing to sell it, forsake that larger profit, will receive a blessing. Generous people help if they are able, if they have those resources, if there's something they can do to help those in need. A third principle of generosity: generous people save for others rather than consuming all their assets for personal use. Proverbs 13:22, a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, and the wealth of the sinner is stored up for the righteous. Spending everything that you make causes one to go away from living a righteous life into selfishness. Right? Because you're consumed about yourself. You spend everything that comes in, goes out. Because you're spending it on yourself for whatever reasons, on whatever things, whatever items. And we know that's a prevalent attitude in our society. I can't remember the statistic, but it's a large percentage of our people couldn't come up with $500 or $1,000. I think it's $500 for an emergency. Right? Because everything that comes in goes out. And the one person, was... lived in New York City and had a really good job, right? But they just spent everything that came in. Had nothing saved up. And it leads us to selfishness because, right, we're consumed with myself. How am I going to meet my needs? And not just needs, my wants. That's usually why we spend everything that comes in. But saving for others teaches one to put the needs of others ahead of our own personal desires. So if you're putting money aside, it's like, it's not just about me, but it's about others. You've heard it said, or maybe you've seen the bumper sticker on the back of a really nice motorhome, spending my children's inheritance, right? I mean, that's kind of a mindset out there. And I think there's a little joke and humor to it. But Proverbs here recommends a generous spirit that chooses to provide for your children and their grandchildren. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, and the wealth of the sinner is stored up for the righteous. Generous people save for others so they can help others and not just consume everything they have for themselves. And the fourth principle of generosity: generous people honor God in their kindness to the needy. Proverbs 14:31. He who opposes the poor taunts his maker, but he who is gracious to the needy honors him. We see here the concept of giving to others is like giving to God himself. So if you oppose the poor, it says here, you're taunting his maker, you're taunting God, you're showing contempt for God. Jesus teaches this principle in Matthew 25, where he says in verse 34, then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when do we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When do we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When do we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? The king will reply, I tell you the truth, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me. Giving to others is like giving to God. Generous people honor God in their kindness to the needy. To withhold generosity from another person is to treat both that person and God, in whose image all humans are made, right? All humans are made in the image of God, is to treat them with contempt. Now, in contrast, he who is gracious to the needy honors him. Generosity to the needy honors both that individual and honors God who created them. When helping the needy, there is not only that horizontal connection that's taking place, but there's also a vertical connection that's taking place between you and God. And that honors him. Generous people honor God in their kindness to the needy. Last thing I want to look at this morning is divine payback for generosity. Divine payback for generosity. Number one, Generosity is an investment with a guaranteed return. Proverbs 19:17. One who is gracious to the poor man lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his good deed. One who is gracious to a poor man lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his good deed. So when you're helping out someone who is poor, the proverb says you're actually giving to God himself. And God himself will repay you. Came across this quote: showing kindness to the needy is viewed as lending to God. So because God is no human's debtor, generosity is an investment with a guaranteed return. Now this proverb isn't teaching some type of get-rich scheme, right? You invest in the poor and God is going to repay you big time. And so that's your motivation for helping the poor. It's like, well, I can't wait to see what I get back from God. As I invest in these poor people. It's not encouraging generosity simply because of the reward it will bring, right? Don't be generous to others just because, man, I can't wait to see what I get. Because that's kind of changing it around, and it's greed, right? You want. It's what you can get, what you can have. But if you're a righteous person, which will be demonstrated by the fact that you are being generous to others and those in need, we're told here that your giving will not go unnoticed by God. God will see it. He will repay you for your good deed. At some time, in some way. I can't say it's going to be immediate. I can't say it's going to be within the next month or next year. But in some way, somehow, your good deeds will be repaid by God himself. Generosity is an investment with a guaranteed return. Secondly, generosity towards the poor will lead to God's blessing. Proverbs 22:9. He who is generous will be blessed, for he gives some of his food to the poor. So share what you have to those in need, the proverb tells us, will lead to being blessed. And who here this morning wouldn't say, yes, Pastor Mo, I want to live a blessed life? Here's how one commentator describes the person in this proverb. The individual has a benevolent disposition, a keen social conscience, and concern for the poor, which finds practical expression. The paradox is that because he does not live to himself and is not a prisoner of selfish desires and ambitions, he achieves the highest degree of self-fulfillment. When we think about that, we have politicians in this country that own 3 homes. Not homes that they rent out for investments or whatever purposes, but 3 homes for themselves. And they criticize how awful our country is. It just blows my mind. Right? Here they have so much. They're so blessed. Yet they're so miserable. And all they can think about is more. And more. And we know people like that have so much. And are so blessed. Yet they're miserable. They need that more. They need that one more thing, that one more sale, that one more whatever. And then they think that will lead to what they're looking for. And here, the paradox is, the person isn't living for themselves. Right? Not focused on themselves and their needs in that extra house, or 2 or 3. They're not a prisoner to selfish desires and ambition, more power. Because they're giving it away. And the proverb says they're going to be blessed. Right? And who wants, right? Blessed life. That's all I want, right? I don't need anything else. Just have to be blessed by God. But we often just keep going for more and more and more, hoping that will fulfill that inner need. That we'll receive what we want and what we desire. When all along, all we need to do is be generous, give. And we'll receive exactly what we've been searching for. Generosity towards the poor will lead to God's blessing. Finally, generosity towards the poor will lead to my needs being met. Proverbs 28:27. He who gives to the poor will never want, but he who shuts his eyes will have many curses. So if you're giving to the poor, it says you're not going to want. If you choose to shut your eyes to the poor, you're going to be cursed. Cursed by those people, cursed by others. It's not going to be a good picture. But think about someone who is generous to those in need. Right? You know they're generous. I mean, they don't make a big show of it, but you just know they're a giver, right? And they give and they help. Imagine a time when that person themselves has a need. And that need would be met, right? Because people would be like, man, all they've done is help others, help others, help others. How can we not rally around them and help them at this time? Right? He who gives to the poor will never want, right? Because if there is a time that they have a need, people are going to rally around them and provide for them. God will provide for them through these other people. There's a movie years ago, and this couple, they had all this wealth, but through lawsuits and everything, they lost everything. And one of the last scenes is a beggar comes up to their door. They have this little restaurant, and they invite him in, give him a bowl of soup and some crackers or whatever. I know there's soup involved. And, don't charge them anything, even though they have nothing now. And the guy leaves and finds out that the beggar was actually a newspaper reporter who'd been following their story. And he writes an article in the newspaper about how this down and out couple, when they have nothing, brings him in, takes care of him, helps him. And then, the last scene is all this letters coming into their place, and, $5 from this person, $10 from this person, $50 from this person, right? They just all rallied around, this generous couple who had, at one point had almost everything, but then had nothing. And I think that's what this proverb teaches, right? If you give to the poor, if you're generous, because they've been very generous before all this, then you will never be in want. Generosity towards the poor will lead to my needs being met. One last thought. Generosity demonstrates godly love in action to those who need it. All right, that's being generous. Godly love in action to those who need it. Here's a quote I came across. Generosity is described in Proverbs as a practice that imitates God's pattern of giving to address the needs of others. Right? It's a practice that imitates God's pattern of giving. God has given to us so much. And when we're being generous to others in need, we're imitating God himself. Ephesians 5:1. Be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children. That's what we're to do, imitate God. And when we're generous, we're imitating God's generosity to those in need. The quote goes on to say, the wisdom tradition never teaches that renunciation of possessions in order to pursue a life of poverty. Right, so we're not saying that this morning. Give away everything that you have and live a life of poverty. But it does stress the importance of supporting those in need. So the resources that you do have, use those to help support those in need. In so doing, the writer of Proverbs were emulating the compassion and charity of God himself. One last final quote. In contrast to the human predisposition to hold, spend, grab for oneself. Right? That's our society. Right? Hold on, spend, grab for oneself. It's me. Generosity determines to help, share, and give to others. The practice of generosity rejects the insensitivity and greed that too often dominate people's values, and instead it demonstrates godly love in action to those who need it. The commitment to generosity is rewarded and blessed by God. Generosity demonstrates godly love in action to those who need it. Let's close in a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you for your word. We thank you for the wisdom of Proverbs. And we just thank you for how we know the wisdom of Proverbs is true. We see it. Whether it's been lived out in our lives or in the lives of others. And so often, your word is counter our culture, and it is the case here. Our culture is all about us and getting more and the greed and ignoring those in need. But you tell us to be generous, to imitate you. And Lord, that is my prayer for myself, my family, for those here this morning, for those who will watch later, that we would be people of generosity. As we see needs around us, and as we have opportunity, and as we have the resources, that we would be generous to your honor and to your glory. We ask and pray these things in your Son's name.